Welcome to the 220 session, the BMP Owner Awareness and Effectiveness Study. My name is Royce. I'll be your moderator. This is Kelsey Grover. She's been the stormwater technician for the city of Wenatchee for the last 5 years. She came to the city with a BS in environmental studies and an MS in natural resource management from the Central Washington University. She also has experience working with GIS and community-based social marketing. Kelsey works with all aspects of the municipal stormwater permit, including IDDE, education and outreach, operations and maintenance, and monitoring and assessment.
All right, well, thank you all for being here this afternoon. And again, my name is Kelsey Grover, and I'm going to be discussing the BMP Owner Awareness Effectiveness Study completed as a portion of Section 8 of the Eastern Washington Phase 2 Municipal Stormwater Permit. This study was completed by the City of East Wenatchee, City of Wenatchee, City of Pullman, Chelan County, and Douglas County, and the City of Wenatchee has acted as the lead agency for this study. Okay. So a little bit on our study background. All of the permittees that were involved in this study were Eastern Washington Phase 2 permittees. So in 2011 is when the requirements for new projects to retain the 10-year 24-hour rain event came into play for projects that are greater than an acre. And this also came with the requirement for these agencies to implement some sort of regulatory mechanism to ensure ongoing operations and maintenance. And jurisdictions within our study area, which I'll discuss a little more here in a few moments, have used an operations and maintenance agreement pretty heavily as not only the tool for ensuring ongoing operations and maintenance, but also heavily relied on that as our source of education as well. So a little bit about our study goals and what we were hoping to get from this study. So ultimately is to determine the effectiveness of this operations and maintenance agreement. How well does it do at doing what we think it does, and educating property owners on their ownership of the BMP and their requirement to maintain the BMP. And also we wanted to address some of our assumptions as stormwater managers that we often think the general public has no idea what's going on and that they don't understand their stormwater structures in their neighborhoods, around the community. They don't know where it goes. And so we wanted to take a moment as stormwater managers to reflect on that and really determine if we're making the correct assumptions. And we often assume that this knowledge tends to go down as homes are sold and people change and properties change hands. And then finally, our goal was to use the results of this study to guide our future education programs. What could we do different to move forward and ensure that we're providing the right level of education and that people are getting the information that they need? So before I move too far forward, I will say that the results from the study came in about 2 to 3 weeks ago. So our technical advisory group are still in very active discussions about our steps moving forward. So this presentation is going to be largely about some of the results and our plans moving forward, but we haven't made any solid determination. So if you're interested, our final report will likely be out towards the end of this year. So stay tuned if there's more information that you'd like, if you'd like any more information to follow up. So now a little bit more about our study location and the audience that we ended up selecting. So our study location ended up being the municipal stormwater permit boundaries for the Wenatchee Valley. So Chelan County, Douglas County, East Wenatchee, and Wenatchee. We did work with Pullman on this project, and we had some conversations about our actual audience. Who are we looking to actually contact? And so we talked about the types of different BMP owners and the different ownership types. So we have those who have a BMP on private property. So something that may be like a swale or a dry well serving that one particular home. We also have residential subdivisions that may have a large pond or swale that's serving multiple homes throughout the whole neighborhood. And within that subdivision, there may be multiple structures. Also commercial and multifamily properties where we may have more like a business that's owning or maintaining that. So in some discussions with all of the permittees that were participating, we determined that our largest range and our largest audience was going to be the subdivisions with a BMP serving multiple homes. And so with that narrowed our target or our study area to the Wenatchee Valley. And throughout the Wenatchee Valley, there has been some use of BMPs and ponds and other structures like that prior to the requirements from the municipal stormwater permit. So because of that, we ended up, and I'll talk a little more about this later, that gave us two really distinct groups of throughout our audience. And the early implementations of the structures did not utilize an O&M agreement. So now we'll dive into the experimental design and how we got to where we are now. So as with any major research project, we started with a fairly extensive literature review. And as you may assume, we can find lots of information about the effectiveness of BMPs in different climates, the difference, comparing multiple BMPs against each other, but actually looking at the educational effectiveness, there's a lot less literature. So how do we find that? How do we find effectiveness of a document when we don't really have a lot of precedent or background to go off of? My answer to that is you do more research. And with that, we explored a lot of research techniques of how do we ask these questions and how are we going to gain data that is statistically significant and give us the right type of information. And with that, we ended on the knowledge, attitude, practice approach, or the CAP model. And essentially this model is intended to find statistically significant data that can give you some of that effectiveness information. And it assesses, obviously, as you may assume, people's knowledge of a subject, their attitudes related to it, and how that relates to the practice that they are actually doing. And the study model was actually, I found this as related to a study in the Chesapeake Bay area. They used it to assess how residents were using their knowledge and attitudes related to flooding and source control BMPs. So it seemed like a really good way of moving forward in assessing structural BMPs. So as I mentioned previously, our target audience ended up being subdivisions. And these subdivisions were selected as to whether or not they triggered the 1 acre threshold in Eastern Washington and whether or not they required an O&M agreement. Because we had a significant number of structures built prior to 2011, we also had a number of them that did not have an O&M agreement, which created a perfect test and control group for us. So with our survey design, we ended up using a number of multiple choice yes or no Likert scale questions to gauge responses. We also determined that we wanted to add some images to the survey when people opened it up, because sometimes you may know what something is, but not have the words to put to it. So we figured a picture may help trigger some knowledge that people may not realize they actually had. The survey was administered online and via mail, but we'll jump into that a little more in a few minutes. We also had it translated into Spanish. Based on our limited English proficiency application, Spanish was the only other language that we needed to do besides English. We also tried to keep things at about a 6th grade reading level, just to keep things fairly simple, as we know that stormwater often comes with a lot of jargon that people may not understand. So we tried to keep the reading level fairly simple. And we did that with the test in Microsoft Word. So some of how we ended up collecting our data, our audience selection was done using, we had to build a mailing list. So once we decided that the subdivisions were going to be our target audience, we had to collect a mailing list from the participants in the Wenatchee Valley, which was done using county assessor data and then pulled from a GIS database to then create a mailing list. And then we needed to notify people. We needed to notify people that this study was coming and that it was not just junk mail when they received the information in the mail. So we sent out a postcard, which I'll jump into the postcard and some of the details that we found significant in a moment. But with the postcard, we also did in tandem some information on our city and county websites, as well as the social media pages. So we tried to plaster it as many places as we could so that as people received this information, again, they would know that it was valid and not junk mail. So then the actual survey itself. We had initially planned on providing this as an online or a mail survey, knowing that not everyone would be comfortable with doing an online survey. But when we had talked to our consultant, we worked with Gold Street Design to complete the study and send out the information, collect the study results, and provide analysis for us. they suggested that maybe we stick to the online version because it was a fairly lengthy survey. So by sending out many copies of information, that's going to increase our costs substantially, and the return for a mail survey may not be quite what we were hoping for. So if people wanted, we did provide an option that they could request it, but we didn't have anyone do that. But just to keep our costs manageable and the actual data and mailing process manageable, we stuck with just the online version. And then the survey ran from January of 2023 to February of 2023. We actually had all of the information ready and available to go at around Thanksgiving of 2022, but opted for the holiday season. You get a postcard in the mail asking you to fill out a survey. The chances of you actually doing it, probably a little less likely. So we waited till after the new year when maybe mail was going to slow down a little bit. And then once the survey closed, Gold Street Designs then proceeded to create and compile a report for us. So this is a copy of the postcard that was sent out, and there are some things on this postcard that we put a lot of intention into doing. These were about a 6x9 postcard, so they were fairly large. The screen on the right shows the right. The screen on the right shows the description of the survey, what we were collecting data for and why we were collecting it, as well as on the bottom, we showed the web address for where the survey was located, as well as the white square was where a QR code was located. We provided both the QR code and the web address just to make sure that not everyone is comfortable with using a QR code. So we wanted to make sure that we provided people with an option they may be more comfortable with. In the study description, we also introduced the consultant and the consultant's data collector because we wanted to make sure that people were comfortable and familiar with those names associated with all of our logos. And bringing again back to the logos, we wanted to make sure that as people received this postcard, they were seeing names and logos that they were familiar with. We also used the City of Wenatchee's return address. So again, it's not something that looks like it's going out of state, it's staying local, and that this information is being associated with us. So now for some of our results and discussion and the things that we're taking away from this project. So the first question that we really cared about was what is our citizens' overall familiarity with the stormwater structure within their neighborhood. And as you may have seen from the previous slide, we had about 130 responses with 2 partials. The partial responses were considered complete enough that we could actually use the majority of the data. So when asked, we had the majority of the population was at least somewhat familiar. Their level of familiarity varied a bit, but they had at least some level of knowledge. And with only about 11%, so about 1 in 10 people that didn't have any knowledge at all. And we do have some structures in town that are underground, so it is fair to say that they just may not know because they can't see it. We also asked who people thought was responsible to maintain it. And again, we had over half of the respondents indicate that they believed that their local homeowners association was responsible. And we had a small number, or a reasonable percentage, believing that it might be the city or the county. And when we did the survey, we didn't specify which city or county it was because the way the survey was distributed, it could have been, it could have been either one. So we didn't specify because technically neither one of those would have been correct. Everyone who received the survey, it would have been them or their homeowners association responsible for maintenance. And it does seem significant to note that in the comparison of the data, the individuals who were more familiar with their BMP were more likely to indicate that it was their local HOA that was responsible for maintenance. So the computer decided to try and jump ahead on me a little bit. So you may have gotten a preview of the actual familiarity with the O&M agreement. And I think not to surprise, the majority of the people were not familiar with it. We had some that were very familiar, and again, 59, so over half of the respondents were not familiar at all. But again, we did have 4% that said that that it wasn't applicable, which again, having a test and control group is a valid answer. Whoa, this thing is getting a little too excited about the next slide. So as part of the knowledge attitude practice model, we wanted to ask people about different concerns that they may have, because there's possibilities that they may be familiar with their BMP or maintenance requirements based on things other than the document that's supposed to tell them about that information. So we asked about their level of concern when associated with the BMP. And it was split right down the middle, 50-50. So 50% at least a little bit concerned, others not concerned at all, or they didn't have an opinion. This changed, however, when we provided them a specific list of concerns. So this chart over here shows the darker color is the all responders. So even those who, it was about 73%, even when presented with a list of specific concerns, 73% of them picked at least one. And then among those top concerns that people had were things like mosquito breeding, attracting pests, and neighborhood aesthetics. So things for trash accumulation, vegetation, debris, and things like that. And for those who shared that they had at least a little bit of concern in the previous slide, their top concerns were, again, mosquito breeding, attracting pests, neighborhood aesthetics, and they also added flooding to that list as high levels of concern. We also asked our residents, as we moved into the practice aspect of things, what are the things that they're actually doing? When we've asked them if they have received any information about their BMP, overwhelmingly, they had not. We had about 21% of people who said that they have, and the ones who had received information, and this dropped us down to a total of about 28 people, their majority answer was their HOA had provided them that information. For those who responded other, that they received it from another location, that was typically something like a developer. There are still some developers in our area who are very involved in the post-construction aspect of the developments they complete. So again, we continued. The way the survey was set up online is if you responded yes, that you have at some point received information about your BMP, it was going to provide you the next questions. But if you said no, it was going to take you on to the next. So we didn't end up with a lot of extraneous data that people didn't know or had no opinion. And so when asked about record keeping, those who had some experience with or had received information, most of them still didn't understand about the record keeping. So maybe this is indicating that we are assuming correctly that there's a few individuals who are responsible for record keeping and the majority of the rest don't know. But those who did have an idea assumed that the record keeping was done with checklists for maintenance and things like that. For understanding the maintenance and what they're doing, weed removal and mowing the grass were really high responses, which in most cases was pretty typical of the maintenance for a lot of the ponds and structures in the area. We also asked the respondents, and this goes back to everybody. This jumped back to all the respondents that we had. Overwhelmingly, their response was they want us to directly mail things to them, which was a bit surprising to us. We were thinking that we were probably going to see a lot more online requests, but direct mailings or through the HOA were the common responses. And then some of our data cleaning and analysis. As I mentioned, we had 130 responses, and we ended up with a total, we sent out about 2,000 postcards. So we ended up with about a 7% response rate, which for the size of our population and knowing what a lot of our community engagement looks like around this area, we were pretty happy with. It doesn't seem like a fairly significant number, but due to the level, kind of our understanding of our community, it was a reasonable number. But there wasn't a lot of data cleaning necessary because we didn't have on each postcard, when someone tried to take the survey, there was a unique identifier code that allowed them to punch that in, and that specified who they were, basically where they were going to be from. And it didn't allow them to complete the survey more than once. We did have 2 partial responses, and again, those were considered complete enough that they were able to be included. I believe most of the information they didn't include was the demographic information. So as far as data analysis, again, because we didn't have a super large sample size to work with, the data was presented and shown in percentages. Any additional statistical analysis would have skewed our data in ways that would have made it likely unusable. So there were, and we're still waiting. This is again kind of this is the preliminary look at a lot of what we have collected. We're still waiting for some of the additional demographics and breakdown of kind of how things were actually responded by different categories of individuals. So we kind of, as we move forward, we're going back to the initial thoughts that we had and some of our goals and checking how our data, what we found, how it stacks up to some of our assumptions. Now, because our data, we didn't have a very large sample size, we do have to be fairly careful in making assumptions. As we move forward, we need to be mindful of our community and things that we know about some of the demographics that we actually collected. But the majority of residents did have some idea about their stormwater facility. And we can see that based on levels of concern, obviously it's something, it's maybe not the O&M agreement that's driving that awareness, but they are at least somewhat aware of the structure. And an overwhelming majority was not familiar. So obviously that leads us to coming back to reevaluating our programs. What can we do different? How can we better provide information to our community about their requirements to do operations and maintenance on the structures that they own? And then again, just reevaluating our education programs. What does this mean moving forward as far as how we are going to do this? And taking this data, our technical advisory group, which will consist of the permitted jurisdictions participating, we will be going back and evaluating what does this mean for our community and how can we better provide them with information to remain in compliance and protect their infrastructure. And some of the study logistics. We started this study in about 2021. This was our proposal, getting these documents submitted to move forward. In 2021, we also signed an interlocal agreement. So all of the participating agencies are entered into an interlocal agreement. And then also with the data collection, we had about a year for data collection planned out. And we learned through a previous effectiveness study that we did, allowing extra time for data collection is a really good thing, because once your quality assurance project plan is accepted, that becomes your official timeline. And having done this previously, we learned that sometimes you run into hiccups, you run into things that happen. So we wanted to allow for, if we needed to resubmit survey, we needed to resend survey data out. We wanted to make sure we had plenty of time to get that data collected and analyzed before starting the annual or the final report. And then for costs, we had anticipated with doing an online survey and the number we were sending out, we would likely end up with close to around 40,000, including staff time. And our final consultant costs ended up being right around 22,000. So we came in significantly under budget. I'm assuming largely because we had a much smaller sample size than what we had anticipated, but it still ended up being really cost effective for us to do this study like this. And with that, I am happy to take questions.